You're listening to Systemic Error Podcast. The failure was designed.
Mitch McConnell's wife did something bizarre after he was hospitalized, report, based on an article by Kathleen Culleton. McConnell's Frailty, Chao's Beijing trip, and the performance of normal. The real center of gravity. The story is not that Elaine Chao traveled to Beijing 3 days after Mitch McConnell was hospitalized. The story is that one of the most powerful Republican operators of the last generation was being publicly managed through a health crisis while his family and political orbit kept moving through the machinery of state power as if nothing fundamental had changed. McConnell is not a random senator with a personal medical issue. He has spent decades shaping the Senate into a choke point for democratic governance. His hospitalization is not just a private event, it is an institutional fact. When a figure like that becomes medically unstable, the question is not gossip. It is succession, power, and who keeps the agenda running while the leader is diminished. What the reporting actually shows. The source gives a few concrete facts. McConnell was reportedly found unconscious and taken by ambulance to the hospital on June 14. Chao went to Beijing on June 17 to discuss China-US relations with Chinese Vice President Han Zhang. McConnell's office later said he was working with staff and still recovering. That is the usable record. What matters is how much of the surrounding coverage invites readers to stare at the oddity of timing instead of the structure of influence. Chao was not some uninvolved spouse drifting through an unrelated itinerary. She is a former cabinet secretary and a member of the same Republican power network. A trip to Beijing for a discussion with a Chinese vice president is not casual background noise. It is an exercise of elite access. Power keeps its calendar. The key fact is institutional continuity. McConnell's office kept issuing updates. Staff carried the load. The political brand remained intact. That is how ruling power protects itself, not by becoming healthy, but by routing around weakness through staff, apparatus, and habit. That is also why the story lands with a kind of cold clarity. Democratic accountability is supposed to mean that the public can distinguish between a functioning office and a figurehead being propped up by an organization that keeps operating regardless. Instead, this is what elite politics often looks like. A degraded individual at the top, a disciplined staff below, and major decisions still moving through the system. The misdirection problem. The weakest part of the framing is the temptation to treat this as personal weirdness. It is not bizarre in any meaningful political sense. It is ordinary for power to keep functioning while the public is encouraged to focus on spectacle, family drama, or medical curiosity. The real issue is not whether Chao's trip was emotionally tasteful. It is that the Republican power structure has long depended on figures like McConnell and Chao to translate raw institutional leverage into policy outcomes, judicial capture, and obstruction. That is the durable fact. The rest is distraction. What this episode reveals: McConnell's retirement, repeated hospitalizations, and public freezing episodes all point to something larger than one man's health. They expose the brittleness of a political order that can be held together for years by a small number of highly disciplined operators while democratic repair is delayed, blocked, or outright sabotage. This is what oligarchic politics looks like in practice. Aging gatekeepers, loyal staff, inherited influence, and an electorate asked to treat the whole arrangement as normal. The lesson is not sympathy theater. It is that power on the right has been concentrated so tightly that even obvious decline does not automatically produce accountability. It produces management. The bigger pattern. The broader pattern is familiar. Republican institutions have repeatedly fused personal loyalty, elite networking, and procedural control into a system that survives scandal, incapacity, and contempt for democratic legitimacy. When one node falters, another steps in. When the public notices, the story is made about tone, timing, or etiquette instead of control. That is the real political meaning here. Not a strange travel schedule, not a family anecdote. A ruling class that keeps its machinery running while the people most responsible for it age, fail, and retreat behind staff titles and access. You've been listening to Systemic Error. Thanks to Raw Story for today's article with the automated voice of Ryan. Thanks for listening.